It's my pleasure to introduce Catherine Woollard, Director of the European Council on Refugees and Exiles. Founded in 1974, the ECRE is an alliance of 40 NGOs across European countries, working to advance the rights of refugees, asylum seekers, and other displaced persons across Europe. She is currently a member of the Direct Democratic Progress Institute's Council of Experts and is an expert on mediation and dialogue at the Organisation for Security and Cooperation. I invite Catherine to take the floor and invite you all to enjoy what I'm sure will be a very valuable event. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, and thank you for the invitation to join you this evening. So I've got a couple of slides that I'm going to put up, and I'll talk for about 10 minutes or so, and then sort of open up for your questions, comments, and indeed even criticisms, if you have them, on the approach that we're taking as ECRE and on the wider questions of asylum in Europe. So I'm going to say a few words about the paradoxical situation that we find ourselves in, and then the response of Europe when it comes to forcible displacement. A few comments on the new proposals that are on the table that give a sense, I think, of the continuation of a policy based on a restrictive approach to asylum within Europe, and then some points on the international responses to that. A couple of comments on COVID and whether or not that changes anything when it comes to asylum in Europe. And then just to wrap up with a few questions for discussion where I'd be really interested in hearing your views. And the theme here is asylum in Europe, but Europe in the world. So as ECRE, as the chair has already mentioned, we're an alliance of NGOs that work on all aspects of refugee rights within Europe. We have actually now 106 members in 41 countries of Europe. And those members range from Turkey to Russia to Ukraine to every EU country, as you can see. And the members are doing anything and everything that's linked to the right to asylum and the protection of refugees and other forcibly displaced persons in Europe. At ECRE as an alliance, we're based here in Brussels, and I'm joining you from our office in Brussels. And here we focus on collective action, on litigation. So we are involved in supporting asylum lawyers across Europe. So when they're dealing with an individual asylum case, we provide advice to them on strategies to use, on jurisprudence, on interpretation of law. And we will work with typically some sort of 500 asylum lawyers all across Europe, offering training as well on EU and international law. We are also engaged in strategic litigation, and we run cases in Strasbourg at the European Court of Human Rights, where we regularly intervene in key asylum cases, and in Luxembourg at the European Court of Justice, but also using international mechanisms, UN mechanisms, other Council of Europe mechanisms. So that's litigation. We find ourselves having to rely a lot on litigation because of the hostile political environment on some of these issues, which I'll go on to mention. Our second area of activity is advocacy, where we're trying to influence primarily the European Union. And there I'll mention a few more points in my presentation. And that's why we're here in Brussels, because if you want to influence the EU, then you really have to be here. It is possible to do it at a distance, but generally if the EU is a major advocacy target, then you would be here. We look at policies on asylum in Europe, the Common European Asylum System, on inclusion, integration in European societies, on deportation and return, and on external affairs. And this is maybe the area that's of most interest to your society. So I'll say a few more comments about that in the presentation. And here we look at influencing EU external affairs. Also the foreign policies of individual European countries. And then the final area of our work is communications, where we try to present factual, evidence-based information on asylum in Europe and alternative narratives on the situation of asylum in Europe. Right now we have a campaign running that you can see on our website. I'm not going to flick in and out because that gets annoying with Zoom, but you can look at that separately, called Hardly Rocket Science, which argues that it should be straightforward to have a functioning asylum system in Europe. And instead of trying all the time and putting all these resources in trying to keep people out, it would hardly be rocket science to actually just make asylum systems work effectively. And there you can see we have campaign videos, two versions of a campaign song, including one that is by a Senegalese rapper and one by a singer from Germany. And the lyrics of the song were written by my colleague who's actually still here in the office. They're really excellent. I'm just saying that in case he can still hear me, which is a series of rap battles, including a verse on the Dublin regulation. So that's the work that we're doing. Let us now look a little at some of the politics of this. And the first point that I said I would mention in the structure is this sort of paradox that we find ourselves in. So on the one hand, as I'm sure you're all well aware, we have record levels of global displacement. There are more people forcibly displaced than at any other point in history. And that figure has now reached 79.5 million. And in the last 10 years, it's doubled. And that includes 26 million refugees, of whom around 20 million are under the mandate of UNHCR. Of that nearly 80 million group of forcibly displaced people, about 85% are in developing countries. So that makes displacement a major development issue. And some of the tensions between development policy and approaches to development and the displacement issues will be part of our discussion now. Most of those people are in the same major refugee hosting countries. I won't go through them. We can bring that into the discussion. I'll throw it out as a question to you. Which are the major refugee hosting countries? Sometimes we would assume from the media in Europe that they're all in Europe and that everybody wants to come to Europe. It's of course far from the case. The other question that I throw out to you as well is which are the major countries of origin of people who are displaced? And I think that then takes us into understanding the reasons for displacement. Within Europe, we do have two countries that are that host significant numbers of refugees. One is Turkey and one is Germany. And in the case of Turkey, that's relatively recent. In the case of Germany, this is something going back over 20, 25 years, where the displacement from the conflicts in the Balkans also led to large numbers of people being hosted in Germany. And although that created panic at the time, we see displaced people who have largely been absorbed and integrated into German society. So there's around 750,000 people who settled in Germany after being forced to leave during the conflicts in former Yugoslavia, and then moved from that region. That was largely successfully managed. In the case of Turkey, Turkey hosts more refugees than any other country in the world, currently with 3.6 million, at least 3.6 million Syrian refugees. And then around 400,000 other refugees and displaced people. And this creates many challenges. I would refer to our assessment of the Turkish asylum system, which I think is the only comprehensive assessment of the asylum system in Turkey that we publish as part of the AIDA database, the asylum information database that ECRE manages, where we look at many of the issues arising for refugees in Turkey. And of course, as you all know, that situation results from the EU-Turkey deal, which we can say a bit more about. The reason I'm calling this a paradox is that there is this situation of high levels of displacement globally. And we're including in these figures also internally displaced people who now fall within our persons of concern for UNHCR. Thankfully, after reluctance for many decades, it accepted that IDPs are also part of its mandate. But a very small number of these people are in Europe or have any chance of being anywhere near Europe, but still we see this continuing sense of at times panic, but certainly sort of hostility towards people seeking asylum arriving in Europe. And that dominates the policies and politics of asylum and migration in Europe these days. And it's led to very restrictive policies that are often based on preventing people from arriving. The second paradoxical element, I would say, is that the real crisis in Europe is the demographic crisis. Declining population is something that genuinely does pose a serious economic and some would say even existential threat to Europe. But it coexists alongside a sense of hostility towards people arriving. There are many, many debates about whether the hostility is a sort of blanket hostility towards all migrants, including refugees, or whether there is a more openness to refugees and hostility towards other migrants. And I think, in fact, on that point, what we find is that the discourse is often based on accepting refugees, but skepticism about other categories of migrants, people on the move. Whereas in practice, many of the measures that are put in place harm refugees and those who seek protection more than they do other categories of migrant. And it's not a competition between the two by any means. And even though as ECRE, our focus is on people who are forcibly displaced, we try not to contribute to policies or discourse that stigmatizes other categories of people on the move. But there is a certain, again, in this case, a paradox or an irony in that restrictive measures are often justified by saying, well, this is how we defend asylum, by ensuring that refugees can reach protection, but having a less positive approach to other forms of migrant. And in fact, they have the opposite effect. And I'll come back to this point. So moving on, this slide here, if I was in the room with all of you, I would throw this out as a question and say, what is going on here? But as we're less interactive being online, let me provide the answer as well. So this is a scene from earlier this year when people tried to arrive in Greece from Turkey. And there was an increase in the number of people trying to cross the border and trying to cross the land border from Turkey into Greece. And at that point, the Greek authorities responded, and they were joined by European Union leaders in their response, which is a very harsh response based on trying to push people back at the border. And we had this scene where you see at the front there, Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the European Commission, with Charles Michel, the President of the Council of the EU, flying in and making some quite extraordinary statements about how Greece was Europe's shield against the invaders. And this very militarized scene that took place. And I have to say, what was even more alarming in some ways was this was part of a film, and it was when it was first published by the EU, there was background music accompanying this, as though it were a pop video or a video game. And so you saw a response that was based on preventing people arriving and presenting this as a security issue, of course, because this is very military imagery, and very military language was used. And then at the same time adding this slightly fetishistic touch of sort of glamorizing military responses. And that was when people tried to arrive from Turkey, where we know that most people who have been stuck there are refugees. Even if they weren't refugees, it would still not be, in our view, an appropriate response, but it's even less appropriate. And I think to us, this kind of typifies what's been happening in Europe in recent years. And I'll come back in a minute to the new pact. So the situation currently within Europe is that we have a common European asylum system. And there in Ireland is part of that, opts into part of it, chooses not to opt into other parts of it. But that asylum system is based on creating common EU legal standards on reception, on asylum decision making, on who qualifies as for refugee status, and on responsibility allocation, the Dublin regulation. What we see now are attempts to reform that common European asylum system. And this is partly in response to the so-called refugee crisis of 2015-2016. And here you'll recall that in 2015, around 1 million people arrived in Europe seeking protection, the vast majority of them refugees. And for us, we reject the term the refugee crisis, because this was a political crisis about refugee protection. And instead of Europe collectively responding to that situation and finding a way to manage the arrivals of these people, which was inherently manageable given the numbers of arrivals and the size of Europe, instead what followed was an extraordinary political panic, paralysis in the institutions, and then a reinforcement of the approach that was already developing of preventing access to protection in Europe, sometimes known as Fortress Europe as an approach, and what we call externalization, meaning the outsourcing of responsibility for protection and the attempt to deflect responsibility to other countries and other regions outside Europe. And that response, of course, is epitomized in the EU-Turkey deal, where the basis of the deal, there's a lot of things in the written statement that put in place the deal, but behind it is a political deal whereby Turkey prevents people from leaving, and on the other hand, Turkey receives a set of benefits from Europe. And again, if we were there in person, I would immediately be throwing the question to you of what does Turkey get from the EU-Turkey deal? There's a lot of focus on the money, but it's not about the money. 6 billion euro for a country like Turkey is really not a lot of money. I know that sounds odd when you talk about 6 billion euro, but for the size of Turkey, its economy, that's not enough to buy support. what Turkey gets in exchange are a series of other, in some cases, more shadowy benefits. So it receives a carte blanche to do what it wants at its border with Syria. There couldn't be any criticism of what Turkey's doing there to prevent refugees from entering Turkey, because Turkey itself is preventing people from leaving to Europe. And President Erdogan is able to operate with near impunity when he undermines and attacks democracy and the rule of law in Turkey. It would not be possible again for Europe to, for the rest of Europe to credibly criticize what's happening. There are a number of security concessions that Turkey receives that it wanted. It has, at very least, tacit, but also probably practical support for some of its actions in Syria as a result of its agreement to host refugees. And I would say, in a sense, what's most precious is the power or the leverage that's given to Turkey, because it can extract any concession it wants, because all it has to do is threaten to allow people to leave. And what we saw at the beginning of this year, where we saw Europe's response, this was a moment where Turkey allowed more people to try to cross into Greece. There was a suggestion that it was orchestrated by Turkey, which may or may not be the case. But it's a sense of showing the power that it has. And the reason I say this is because, again, I think for your society and those of you looking at development policies, this is emerging as a kind of model of dealing with different countries, that in exchange for either hosting refugees, for containing people and preventing them from leaving, for controlling borders to prevent the own citizens of the country from leaving, or for readmitting deported citizens, countries are offered a set of benefits. So what we're seeing is a distortion of foreign affairs, including of development policy, based on attempts to prevent migration towards Europe, including migration of those who need protection, who are clearly refugees, and also others. And to give you another example that's happening right now, Afghanistan. So Afghanistan is a fragile, conflict-affected, a very poor country, as we know. I mean, there's been more than 40 years of conflict of one kind or another. The EU has just negotiated a continuation of its agreement with Afghanistan called the Joint Way Forward. And this agreement is based on making the development money that goes into Afghanistan conditional on Afghanistan accepting back deported people who are deported from Europe. So there you see also the idea of one of the things that's offered, or I don't want to say offered, because it's more a question of negative conditionality. So development assistance that would otherwise be provided based on the SDG as a framework, based on the priorities of the country itself. Instead, development assistance is only provided if the country takes certain measures related to migration control, such as readmitting its own citizens, or the money is then diverted to be used for something that is linked to migration control. And there are many, many other examples which we can come to in the discussion if that's of interest. I'm going to wrap up with a few more points on what's happening right now. One of the things that you may have heard under the discussion is the new pact on asylum and migration, or indeed on migration and asylum, which is the latest proposal from the European Commission for the future of asylum in Europe. Except that it's not really about asylum in Europe. It's about keeping asylum and asylum seekers out of Europe. Within that pact, we see some of the elements that I've mentioned there. A border instrument, which is about having asylum procedures at borders, rather than allowing people to enter the country and then apply for asylum and be treated in the regular procedure. It's not going to be mandatory for everybody, but it covers a certain number of those arriving. Screening processes, which also take place at the border before people are allowed to enter, where again they're screened for different purposes. There's a very, very strong focus on return. And here I've mentioned that as the third point, returning to return. The Commission returns to return policies and return as the solution, but in a way it never left. And there is this ongoing debate, and in my understanding, but you can correct me if I'm wrong in the discussion, I haven't heard this characterizing the Irish debate as much as in certain other countries. But certainly we hear it very often that the way to save asylum in Europe is to return all of the people who are not entitled to protection. And the focus there is on what's called the effective return rate. The percentage of those who have a return decision who are actually returned. And the figure is quite low. It's about 35%, I think, of those who should be returned and who are actually returned in the end. Here, that for us, there are multiple problems, we would say, about saying that returning people is the answer to everything. There are multiple different challenges in asylum systems, and they need to be tackled directly rather than through this disproportionate attention on return and deportation. There's also many people, the majority of those who arrive currently in Europe are entitled to protection, and this is often ignored in the discussion. So we hear European leaders all the time saying the majority who arrive are not refugees, they don't get protection. This is not true. They're actually looking at first instance decision making, and if you look at the decisions after appeal processes, which is a normal way a legal process works, then people in the end of their process often have a positive decision. But the very heart of the pact in many ways is the external aspect, and this is why I put here external help. There's still a very strong focus on working with other countries to get them to host more people, to host more refugees, to prevent people from leaving, be they their own citizens, third country nationals, others. And we have this sort of ironic situation, again, I'm talking about paradox and ironies, where internal affairs policymakers are increasingly intruding into external affairs, including development policy. So the parts of the European Commission that work on internal affairs, the internal affairs commissioners, but also interior affairs ministers from the member states. So the Justice and Home Affairs Council, which brings in all the interior affairs ministers, including your own there from Ireland, they increasingly spend their time discussing how to get other countries to support this agenda and how to work with other countries and developing partnerships with other countries. For us, the great risk in all of that is that, firstly, it doesn't work. And that's partly because most other countries don't share this agenda that Europe has and actually consider migration to be a positive thing. And they find it a very neo-colonial approach often as well, to say we'll offer you a small amount of money and then you do what we want and prevent people leaving. We also see popular protests in many countries against European migration agreements. So this includes recently Mali or the Gambia, where the public has protested against the governments cooperating with Europe. And it's also for us undermines the real objectives of development policy, but also of security policy or trade policy, which are not there to be used just to meet this this particular agenda. So let me conclude on this. We see this as all part of a bigger strategy called externalization, where you try to externalize responsibilities and indeed people themselves using internal policies, deterrence and deportation, border policies, preventing people from arriving, including using violence, which is now commonplace at Europe's borders, and then external policies, either capturing external policies or creating parallel external policies that then undermine the development policies or security policies that are running. And I think the question for those of you working on development issues is, what is the impact of this in other countries? And what is the response that we see? What is the likely response? And which kind of countries are happy to go along with this approach? From our perspective, there are alternatives. Even though we criticize a lot, we try to set out our alternatives, making asylum work in Europe through compliance, safe and legal routes to arrive at Europe for asylum migration and non-asylum migration, focusing on inclusion, and then foreign policy that focuses on actually the causes of displacement. And meeting the SDG, for instance, would be probably the easiest way to actually, I don't want to use the word prevent, but to make it less likely that people need to leave the places that they're from. That is the COVID virus. I'll leave it there. If you want, if you have questions about the impact of COVID on the situation, happy to bring that up in discussion. And there are a few points that I wanted to throw out, looking at this situation. Globally, if we look at Europe placed within the wider global context, what are the other things that we can propose, including for development policy, beyond just saying these policies should meet their own objectives, which we continue to say. We say development policy should be about meeting the SDG, not about preventing migration to Europe. Money should be based on the priorities of the country, not conditioned on accepting Europe's priorities. But are there other ways to integrate displacement into development policy and security policy, for that matter, that would be more sophisticated? Does it deserve more recognition? Because the SDGs are relatively silent on migration, refugee protection, and wider questions of forced displacement. So do we need more explicit links? How to change the approach of Europe? Is more EU a good thing or a bad thing? We tend to think of the EU as increasing standards, but the new pact that's been presented and the EU-Turkey deal, these are measures that show the EU actually working in a way that undermines standards. And overall, can we link internal and external policies in a more human rights-based way?